Thank you guys so much for coming here tonight. This is my true pleasure to be here. This is my first lecture. I am the new executive director, Lauren Weston. I've been in the organization 4 months. And so far I have seen now all, with this evening included, all of our program components. And I am continually impressed about the work that Acterra does in the communities that we serve. And all the ways that we do that work. We're working in electrification. We're working in underserved and underrepresented communities. We're at the forefront of EVs. It's really incredible how we serve the communities that we do and the wide swath of programming we provide. I'm so excited to share this work with you. I'm excited that we're part of the lecture series tonight together with Bill. Huge thanks to the Foster. I mean, if you've had the time to walk around, the Foster is about this amazing journey and the beauty of nature, and we get to be part of that. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Thanks to the Foster, making sure I'm not forgetting anyone. Our sponsors, of course, the Air District, the Foster itself, the Gillilands, just amazing opportunities that they provide us for these education moments together, and I can't thank them enough for their support. And I get the pleasure of introducing Bill, who I have had many hours with over the last few months, and I'm so appreciative of that. He has a lot to teach me, and I'm so grateful for his time. He, of course, is here to talk about corporate advocacy this evening, so I want to turn the mic over to Bill.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. And one moment, I've got this for some notes just in case I get lost or fall asleep or something. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all for coming out. I know some of you. There are actually a remarkable number of faces I don't recognize, but hopefully I'll get to know all of you a little bit better. I want to talk about what we need to do and what I think needs to happen for us to actually meet the challenge that the climate, I'll call it an emergency because I think it is, that the climate emergency poses. And we need to treat it like an emergency, and everybody needs to act like it's an emergency. So we have seen amazing leadership by companies, I think, over the last decade. Compared to 10 or 15 years ago, what companies have done has been, I think, extraordinary, and I've been lucky to play a part in that at Google and at Facebook and working with many, many other companies. It hasn't been enough. And so the theme of this talk is One Giant Leap for Mankind, Corporate Climate Leadership in the Next Decade. And it's really about getting companies to move from the individual actions they're taking in their operations and in some cases in their supply chains to advocacy for policies that will actually scale all of those amazing solutions to the entire society, the entire economy at the speed that we need it, because this problem is all about speed and scale. And that requires policy. And policy, success on the policy front is going to require advocacy, not just action. I use the phrase one giant leap for mankind. Many of you probably recognize this picture. I saw it on, I think, an 11-inch diagonal black and white TV with really shitty reception back in 1969 when I was almost 12 years old. That's Neil Armstrong about to put his foot on the moon. And you may remember his famous statement, that's one small step for man, and I think he meant to say a man, but I think he just said man, but one giant leap for mankind. And it really was. I mean, he and a small number of other men, only men, set foot on another body in the solar system. It's the only, that happened for a few years in the late 60s, early 70s, and that's it. Hopefully someday we'll do that kind of thing again, but he was one of my earliest heroes. I was in awe at this, I was inspired by it. The effort it took from when Kennedy said we're going to the moon until we got there, and then for a number of years after, was extraordinary and inspiring. And it was much easier than what we have to do on climate. So I think it's a useful metaphor and a useful point of inspiration. And it's time for companies to make, in some sense, a similar leap from what they might do for themselves to what they need to do for all mankind. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay, let's see if I can. So let me start by saying a little bit about myself. I think there was a short bio in the information about this. I know some of you, but not all. But to paraphrase Admiral James Stockdale, Ross Perot's running mate in 1992, some of you probably remember him. Some of you may remember better the SNL parody of him, which was actually really funny, who I think there was probably only one vice presidential debate who, in the debate sort of opened by saying, well, who am I and why am I here? Which I don't know why that phrase is stuck in my head, but it did. So I've had a long career starting in academia. I got a PhD at MIT. I was on the faculty there. I got tenure. I came out here on sabbatical. I lost the return ticket or threw it away or something. Well, all sorts of reasons I stayed out here. I was at Digital. Well, that color isn't working too well, but it's sort of about what happened to Digital. Many of you remember Digital, which then became part of Compaq. I was still there when that acquisition/merger happened, and then that became part of HP, which still exists in several incarnations in parallel. So I don't quite understand how this happens. Anyway, so I was there. Then I went to a startup called Akamai, still around, huge. They're building a gigantic new headquarters in Cambridge, Mass. I was chief architect and then CTO there. And then I hit the total freakout stage on climate. I've been hearing about climate change in the 90s. I've sort of been an environmentalist my whole life, but in the late 90s, I was learning more about climate change, like this is scary. But Bush and Gore both said they would regulate CO2, so, it was all gonna be good. We all know how that worked out. And by 2004, as we were kind of moving into that was Kerry, I think, right? Ran against Bush. Into that election, it seemed pretty clear that Bush wasn't going to do anything. It wasn't clear if Kerry got elected he would be able to do anything. And I was increasingly freaked out. And at 3 a.m. when I couldn't sleep, if it wasn't because one of my kids was screaming and waking me up, what I was thinking about was not the really hard, cool, interesting problems that I was working on at work, it was climate change. And so I decided it was a good time to see if I could do something professionally on climate. And I was lucky enough about a year later, beginning of 2006, to land a job at Google, where they basically said, we want to do something on climate. We don't quite know what that means, what we could do, what needs to be done, figure it out. That was an extraordinary, sort of job to be handed. And I feel lucky and grateful they took a chance on me, and I think I did all right. So I did that for 6 years, and then I went to Facebook in a similar role. The Google job turned into a sort of broader sustainability role. Facebook was sustainability from the get-go, though the big focus was energy, and as a result, climate. So I touched most of the parts of this big, complicated system that need to change. It doesn't mean I've been deep in every one, but it's R&D and innovation, it's deployment, it's startup companies, it's finance, both on the project finance side and the investing, sort of venture investing side. It's policy, it's all sorts of other stuff. It's human psychology, God help us, sort of part of the problem. And I've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. And so what I want to focus on today is what I think is needed and is missing today. Because there's a lot of great stuff happening, but I think the evidence is pretty clear it's not enough. And I'm here to issue a call to action to companies. And many of you work for companies, not all, but most of you know people who work for companies. And everyone who works for a company can play a role in pushing companies to do more. Okay, so the call to action for companies is what you've been doing for the last decade or more, or for some maybe it's the last year or two, is great. It's been incredible leadership. We need more. So it's time to step up. And maybe past time, but as a number of people have said, the best time to act on climate was probably 25 or 30 years ago. The second best is now. So let's not wait until tomorrow or 5 years from now or 10 years. It's time to get going and treat it like the emergency it is. So to set a little context and to butcher a phrase from Game of Thrones, the youth are coming. And this is a picture of Greta Thunberg, who has become maybe the poster child of the youth movement. She's not in any way the only leading youth activists. There are at least 1,000 other people between 14 and 25 who are real leaders in the youth movement, and there were 6 to 8 million young people in the streets a few weeks ago around the world. So this is a movement. But she has been speaking with a moral clarity and a simplicity of message that has been resonating and has gotten a lot of young people to rise up. And I think it's beginning to have an impact. And the thing that I found interesting, having been working in the climate space for 15 years, is we spend a lot of time in the climate world debating what's the right message and how do we motivate people. And we don't want to scare people too much, because then they'll check out and just say, oh, it's just too complicated and we're doomed, so I'm going to go drink wine and enjoy the beach. And maybe that's true for people my age and some of your ages, but she's not speaking from a place of hope. Young people are terrified. And that terror is turning into passion and energy and action, and also anger at all of us, because we've been not really addressing the problem. So I think we all have ideas about what the right message is, and honestly, I think the truth is that the right message differs for different people. Some people, you say, there's an opportunity to make an enormous amount of money, trillions of dollars, they'll go, I'm going there. Other people, like, I have enough money, I don't care. But you say, the world's gonna end if we don't do something, okay, I can do that. So people are motivated by different things. There isn't one message. But what we need to do is get all of us together to act. So she's inspired millions of people around the world, including adults. She has embarrassed, and her peers have embarrassed world leaders, and they have begun to shift. Not enough, but some. I was in New York, I guess it's now about almost 3 weeks ago, for the climate strike, and then the day after the strike on Saturday, there was a youth climate summit at the UN that I was lucky enough to get an invitation to observe. It was young people speaking. And there were world leaders, like the Secretary General was there, but to listen, and a few people like him got to respond, but they weren't there to give speeches. They were there to listen and absorb and react. And it was really powerful. And the energy and the passion and the fear and the anger on Friday during the strike and then on Saturday at the summit at the UN were palpable. I was also in New York then the following week for a few days for what's called Climate Week, where the UN had a climate summit, official UN governmental meetings, and then all around New York City were many other meetings organized by companies and by NGOs and so on. And I would say the contrast between the message from young people and the energy and the sense of urgency that they conveyed, and what was conveyed during Climate Week, which was companies are doing great stuff and they just need to do more and it'll all be fine, was sort of the implication, I think was striking, and to my mind, wrong. It might have been a good approach 10 years ago or maybe even 5 years ago. It's pretty clear it's nowhere near enough today. So we need to act on that fear and with a sense of urgency. I do want to say there is reason to hope. It's not hopeless. There is climate change already. Most of you are from the Bay Area. Maybe all of you are from here. If you were in the Bay Area a year ago in November during the fires, we were all walking around wearing masks because the air was so painful to breathe. And when was the last time that happened here? 2 years ago there were some bad fires, but it was like a couple days. Last year, 2 weeks. I grew up in Cincinnati. I wish we had all worn masks when I was a kid in the summer, because the air quality in the summer with air inversions was awful. But last year, it was like Beijing. And that fire wasn't caused by climate change. It certainly was made worse by climate change, and our fire seasons are worse because of climate change. So there are effects that are already happening, but there is hope in the sense that we have choices to make, and we can choose to sort of continue on the path we're on, and just things will get worse and worse, and we'll end up with 3, 4, 6, 8 degrees C of warming. Or we can choose a different path and maybe hold warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees C, and there'll be worse changes than we're already seeing, but much less bad, certainly, than if we let things warm a lot. So there are reasons to hope, and there's a lot of good stuff happening. We've seen companies setting targets and acting. There are these various initiatives and groups called RE100 and EV100 and REBA, the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, all of which are about companies setting really ambitious targets for their operations and banding together to work together to help each other meet these targets. So there's a lot of great stuff happening. And we know how to transform our electricity grid. We know how to decarbonize most transportation. We don't really know today how to do airplanes or ocean travel, long distance ocean travel in a cost effective or maybe even at all. But we have ideas, and we have time to deal with those if we deal with the other stuff aggressively. We know how to decarbonize buildings. I don't know if this building has a kitchen, but half the residential dwellings in the US have natural gas. And many commercial buildings have natural gas. And we burn as much natural gas in buildings, commercial and residential buildings, not industry, but buildings for heating, hot water, cooking, and clothes drying. Those are the main uses. We burn as much natural gas in buildings for those as we do in power plants. And we burn a lot in power plants. The amount that we burned in power plants has exploded in the last, pun not intended, in the last decade or two because of fracking and abundant cheap natural gas. And natural gas, along with wind and solar, have displaced a lot of coal. So natural gas on the grid has gone way up. Natural gas in buildings has also gone way up and is huge. We need to stop combusting that natural gas. And maybe in 20 or 30 years, we'll have enough direct air capture that's cost effective to actually pull it out of the atmosphere so we could keep burning it. But we don't have 20 or 30 years to make the kind of progress we need to make. So there's hope. We're making progress. We know most of what we need to do, but it's not enough. What we've been doing to date is not enough. Last year, energy consumption and emissions from energy increased at a record rate globally. So, there were a few years where in the US we saw emissions drop, and globally we saw them sort of plateau, and then they went back up. Okay, so you could say, well, we've made progress, but it certainly isn't enough. And depending on whether you're a glass half empty or a glass half full kind of person, you might think we're failing, and we're certainly not on track to stay below 1.5 or 2 or probably even 3 degrees of warming. Or, as I've had some people say, no, that's the wrong message, we're not failing, we're just not winning fast enough. Like, I don't care which message works for you, but we need to move a hell of a lot faster. So we need to hold on to the hope, but we need to act with a much, much stronger sense of urgency. So Hal Harvey, if you've heard of him, he's one of the smartest people I know in the climate space, engineer and policy wonk who understands all of these systems at a much deeper level, I think, than I do. But he likes to emphasize it's all about speed and scale. We need to deploy solutions and decarbonize at this point, a crazy fast rate and at enormous scale. And doing that requires making very conscious choices. For those who are market fundamentalists and think that the answer to most things is Adam Smith should be up there, using the strings with his invisible hand. Well, Adam Smith actually talked about well-regulated markets, though these days when market fundamentalists talk about market fundamentalism, they forget that part. But it won't get us there fast enough. The IPCC a year ago in the 1.5 degrees C report that they put out gave us pretty clear guidance. If we want to have about a 2/3 chance in their estimation of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade, and we're already at about 1, so that's not too far away. We need to decarbonize 45% by 2030 That's from a 2010 baseline, so it's more like 50 or 55% from today, because emissions today are higher than 2010. And we need to decarbonize 100% by 2050 and then go negative, if we want to have a hope of staying below 1.5 degrees. So, and people like to talk about, well, okay, mid-century we need to be net zero or net negative, but we can innovate and do all sorts of things and we'll get there. But if we don't do the 50% by 2030, we will have baked in 3 or 4 or 5 degrees of warming. And what we do from 2030 to 2050, it will matter, but things will be pretty catastrophic. So that it really isn't a 30-year problem, it's a 10-year problem. And given the amount that we have to do, that to me, that's an emergency. That's not, we can take our time and be measured and careful. It's like, we got to figure this out and do it. So speed and scale. And the question to my mind is, what can we do, what do we need to do to have reasonable confidence that we will actually hit that 2030 target? And I have my own biases about what might make me feel like there's confidence. I'm not a fan of, honestly, of the models and the way of thinking that many economists have, because I think it is driven in many cases from a belief that the only thing that really works well is putting a price signal on things and then letting the market work its magic, and that is more efficient. And that does matter, that does work. I don't believe it's the only thing, and I actually believe, given the speed and scale at which we have to operate, the risk of only doing that is really high, that we wake up in 10 years and go, well, that was a good try, and now we're heading toward 3 or 4 degrees of warming, and there's nothing we can do about it. We need individual action. I mean, I talked a little bit, and you know, you can go read about all the amazing things that companies have been doing. We need individual action by all of you and everyone we know, and you know, put solar in your house and buy an electric car, or get rid of your car and ride a bike, whatever, don't eat meat, everything. Individual action is really important. It is not going to solve the problem. What we need is systemic change, but to get that, we all have to take responsibility for it. All of us as individuals, but also all entities, companies, et cetera, that have influence in our system. And that's really the core of the point I'm trying to make tonight, that companies have enormous influence, and they are not using it to drive systemic change. They are acting in their own operations and then stepping back and saying, well, if everyone would follow our example, we'd be fine. But I'd say the evidence of the last 15 years is everyone isn't following their example, and I'll say a little bit about why that is. So getting this, in my mind, requires policy. And when I say policy, I don't mean socialism, whatever the hell that means. I don't mean government, ownership, public ownership of the means of production, et cetera, et cetera. What I mean by policy is market rules that guide us with reasonable confidence onto the decarbonization path we need to be on. And those market rules could include a price on carbon, they could include clean energy mandates, they could include all sorts of other things. California, I think, actually has a pretty good suite of policies that don't have us quite on the path we need to be on, but getting pretty close. But there is no single silver bullet policy, just like there's no single silver bullet technology. And we need those rules, or we're going to keep seeing good stuff happen, and when we do good things, we'll feel good, but we'll still all go off the cliff together. Fires will burn up entire towns, and we'll have, I'm guessing, I don't know what how far above sea level we are here, but probably not very far. So, and when I was at Facebook, the Facebook headquarters in Menlo Park is basically at, it's probably 3 feet above sea level, right? So, in a king tide and in a big storm, this is all going to be underwater. And in 50 years, it will just be underwater pretty much all the time. So we need policy, not just hope that somehow it will all work out. We've seen a lot of innovation. People talk a lot about technology. This is Silicon Valley. You know, innovation is the lifeblood of this place, and we're really good at it. And people talk a lot about AI and blockchain and materials and microgrids as things that will solve climate change. You know, I feel like I can't go 10 minutes without seeing another headline cross one of my devices about this thing that could be the solution to climate change. There was just a thing about, you know, bracelets made out of thin air because they're sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and they're turning them into some carbonate that they're using to make bracelets. So make the direct air capture tangible. It's like, if people buy those and it makes them feel like actually that the solutions are just around the corner, we're totally screwed, right? I mean, you know, we need to decarbonize the power sector, we need to decarbonize buildings, we need to decarbonize transportation, and also industry and agriculture quickly. And direct air capture that maybe in 20 or 30 years is at a scale that is big enough to be significant is not something to get people focused on and thinking, oh, it's right, it's just around the corner, look, it's on my wrist, right? I mean, it drives me crazy. You know, AI, Microsoft, AI for Earth, they I don't know what the number is now, but you know, a few years ago, they basically committed $50 million to helping develop AI-based solution, using AI to help make the Earth a better place and help make the Earth greener. And it's amazing. And Google with Google Earth and Google Earth Engine similarly, which is AI and big data and so on, it's amazing. Blockchain, well, I actually think it's unlikely blockchain will make a material difference in this problem. I'd be happy to have that debate with people. I think blockchain's really interesting, but the acolytes think it's the solution to everything, as acolytes often do. And given what I know about our energy system and what we have to do, I don't think the problems that are preventing us from moving faster are addressed in pretty much any way by blockchain. Materials, absolutely. Microgrids, absolutely. AI, to some extent. So innovation is great. Lots has been happening. But remember that polluters can innovate too. So you may have seen this headline in the spring, and there was another one focused on Microsoft, I think, a few days before the climate strike. Basically about, it was Google, Microsoft, and Amazon selling custom AI and cloud services to Exxon and Shell and basically big oil and gas. And you might think, that's terrible, they shouldn't do that. In fact, a lot of employees are saying, that's terrible, we shouldn't do that. And at some level, I think they're right. But it's not at all surprising. I mean, oil and gas have been at the forefront of using the bleeding edge of computing technology for at least 30 or 40 years. I mean, when I was at MIT and we were working on what we call distributed computing and parallel computing and supercomputing, some of the earliest commercial applications of supercomputing were seismic modeling, because they're basically using seismic waves to take what you'd call a CT scan of the Earth. That requires there's a lot of data, and back then it seemed like a lot. Today it would probably, I don't know, fit on my watch, but a lot of data and an enormous amount of computing to figure out what did all that data tell you about the rock formations and what's actually down there and how hard it would be to drill and so on. And as computing's gotten better, they've stayed on the bleeding edge. And the bleeding edge today is AI and elastic cloud infrastructure. So of course they're there. And if Google and Microsoft and Amazon didn't sell it to them, they do it themselves. Now, I think those guys could still take the moral stand and say, well, you can use our infrastructure, but we're not going to actually actively aid and abet this. But so Microsoft's put $50 million in AI for Earth, and then they probably put, I don't know, $1 million in helping Exxon build custom solutions, where the negative impact of those custom solutions in terms of making oil and gas cheaper and easier to extract probably completely swamps the positive impact of that $50 million in AI for Earth. Certainly in the next 10, 20 year time frame. Long term, maybe it's the other way. And to some extent, I'd say it doesn't really matter which has bigger impact. This is a big negative. And if we rely on innovation, the people who focus on that forget that, in some sense, the other side can innovate too, and they have a lot of resources and they're really good at it. So innovation alone won't fix it. We need to phase out the bad and phase in the good with rules that give us some confidence that'll happen. Similarly, there's been a lot of talk about how just information and communications technologies are going to decarbonize everything because we're moving to this virtual world and we're digitizing everything, and we're doing video meetings instead of coming in person. Of course, we're all here, and I think it actually works a lot better, but this could be over Zoom or something. And it is true that for any single meeting, if people do it over video instead of flying, or maybe even driving across town, it is lower emissions. It's better for the environment. The question is, has the introduction of all this technology been net positive or net negative for the environment? And all of the studies, which are pretty limited, and honestly, I don't know why they had to go to the effort to actually do a study, but all the studies are about a meeting. We do a meeting if it's done by flying, very carbon intensive. If it's done by video, yeah, there's some routers and monitors plugged in and cameras, and they use some energy, and maybe that's coal. But it's still really small compared to flying people across the country or halfway around the world. So you look at one meeting, it's great. But if you look at the system, business travel has grown. And it's actually grown at an average annual rate faster than the economy. Now, is that because we've introduced all this great collaboration technology, or in spite of it? I don't know. No one's really studied it carefully, and it may be really hard to tease apart. But if we're relying on this idea that somehow if we virtualize and decarbonize things, that will naturally lead to a much less carbon-intensive economy, it's not clear that's true. Business travel per unit of GDP and per employee has grown. And actually I have hypotheses like, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, you couldn't collaborate closely with people across the country or halfway around the world because it meant really expensive phone calls or mailing, paper. And so you couldn't, you had to fly and it was really expensive, so people mostly didn't. And today, with Zoom and Slack and email and chat and video conferencing and et cetera, people collaborate with people halfway around the world where the only real barrier is time zone. We more or less need to be awake at the same time. And actually sometimes it's like, well, we're working during the day here, and then when we're asleep, you're picking up and you're working over there, and we go back and forth and we're exchanging all this digital information. Occasionally we actually talk, but we don't even have to be awake at the same time. But what I've observed is today, lots of engineers travel because they're working closely with people, in London or Dublin or Paris or Seattle or whatever, and they want to actually be in a room with them a couple times a year and get in front of a whiteboard, and they want to have a beer with them or a meal or whatever. So they travel, and they didn't used to. So is that why business travel is going up? I don't know. No one has studied it carefully. But the short story is, from all the best data I've been able to find, business travel's gone up. So these solutions that are, virtualizing the world, not clear they are. So again, without rules that decarbonize and force the decarbonization, we're believing things are happening, and when we look at a tree, that tree's doing great, and when we look at the forest, like the whole canopy's on fire. But we're not looking at the forest, we're just looking at one tree that isn't on fire. That's probably a pretty mangled metaphor. There's also been a shitload of money committed by major banks to green finance, green bonds and funds that are focused on investing in wind and solar. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars, which is amazing. And we need more of it. But at the same time, there was a study that was put out by Rainforest Action Network and by a bunch of others, but I think they were the main group behind it, came out this spring that said in the 3 years or 2.5 years since 2016, the 33 banks funneled $1.9 trillion into fossil fuel infrastructure and fossil fuel projects. So yes, there's a lot of green stuff happening, a lot of money flowing there, but it's dwarfed by the money that's still going into the legacy infrastructure, because there's a lot of money to be made there. And as long as there's money to be made there, that's going to keep happening. And as we keep expanding that infrastructure, that's just more stuff that we have to deprecate, at some point. So we need to decarbonize the whole system. It's a system problem. It's not about, this meeting, let's do it over VC. It's not about, great, let's go build a solar farm over there. It's about looking at the system and decarbonizing. We need to do it really quickly. Markets got us into this mess, and markets will get us out. But the markets need rules to ensure the markets go the right way. So I believe, you may have heard of what are called science-based targets. There's an initiative called the Science-Based Target Initiative that was started 4 or so years ago by several NGOs. I think one of the main ones is called We Mean Business, which is basically getting companies to commit to targets for their own operations, decarbonization targets, that are consistent with what the science says we all need to do. Now, I've long felt that, given that they've got, there are 300 or 400 companies, I think, that have committed to science-based targets now. These companies are they are leaders, they're viewed as leaders, but holding up as leadership, companies doing what is essentially the average of what the entire economy needs to do, to me, that's not leadership, that should be a bare minimum, number one. Number two, this is about individual action. A company is taking action in its operations, and maybe now in its supply chain, because a lot of companies are beginning to push on their suppliers. But that is not creating the system change at the pace we need. So it's time for companies to make the leap from science-based targets to supporting a science-based policy agenda. And those policies are going to be different in different jurisdictions because the culture is different, the existing policies are different, so they've got to work with the policies that are already in place. The political climate is different. Bernie Sanders, a place that, Vermont might adopt a very different set of policies from Tennessee, because Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul's from Tennessee, right? Assuming Rand Paul got on board with, we need to act on climate and we need policies, the policies he would be willing to support or be inclined to support are very different from what Bernie would support. That's fine, as long as they give us reasonable confidence we're going to get there. But we need companies to make this leap, because without corporate support for these policies, we're having a really hard time getting them to happen. So what does that look like? I think what that means is companies need to be strong advocates, really champions for regional decarbonization, consistent with what the science requires, everywhere they operate, and ideally everywhere they source, the chairs and tables and stuff in their offices and the equipment in their factories, but also the products that get manufactured maybe in a factory in Asia by some third-party manufacturer that they then sell. They have influence where they've got offices, where they've got factories, where they've got suppliers, and they could use it to drive real change systemically in those places. They're not, mostly not today. And that's going to take standing up to other companies, to utilities, to fossil fuel companies, to politicians who won't be happy about this. It's going to take courage. It does entail some risk. But that risk can be mitigated, especially if we can get a bunch of companies to do it together, because there is almost certainly, in that kind of situation, safety in numbers. So I want to digress with a story, which is part of what inspired me to think along these lines. And it's about the stages that companies went through in engaging in the issue of LGBT rights over the last, let's say, 20 years, but particularly at the state level, though also it happened nationally and it's happened in other countries as well. But before 2010, over the probably 15 or maybe even 20 years before that, we had many companies, by 2010, many companies basically standing up and saying, we don't discriminate. We offer equal benefits to people in domestic partnerships. we don't discriminate in hiring, we don't discriminate in who we serve, we'll bake a cake for anybody. And I mean, there were some companies that were saying, we discriminate and we're proud of it, but there were a lot of companies standing up and saying, we are good actors. In our operations, we have policies against discrimination. And they weren't perfect by any means, and they certainly weren't implemented and executed perfectly, but this was huge leadership compared to, say, 1990. And then, in 2015, we saw companies make a leap. Over 360 companies joined an amicus brief in the Supreme Court case on marriage equality. I mean, this was corporate America. Many big companies, some small companies, over 360 companies saying, we think this is the right thing for the economy, for our businesses, and oh, by the way, we paid some really high-priced lawyers to explain why it really is the right thing constitutionally. Because in the end, the Supreme Court has to have arguments about that to rely on. And I believe, I've got to believe that, that both the cultural shift we'd seen over the previous decade, just in society broadly, but also that kind of statement from much of corporate America had to have had an impact on the court. For all that they might say, we're just, referees calling, or umpires calling balls and strikes, and it's just based on what the Constitution says. I mean, the Constitution doesn't say anything about marriage equality directly, it's interpretation. And so I've got to believe that mattered. And then that same spring, Indiana passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which some of you may remember. Salesforce and a bunch of other companies and some sports organizations and nonprofits basically stood up to Indiana and said, you know what, this is going to change how we do business in the state. Salesforce had just a couple years before, bought a small software company in Indianapolis, and they were planning to hold a major, big conference, lots of economic activity in the state from that conference. They moved it. And they said to the state, we may have to rethink our presence here completely. And a bunch of other companies did the same. And Indiana fixed it. They didn't repeal it completely, but they fixed the worst parts. And then in 2016, North Carolina passed its bathroom bill, which you may also have heard of. And again, companies lobbied against it. It passed anyway. And then companies said, well, actually, we really meant it when we said we didn't like it and we didn't want you to pass that, so now you need to fix it. And it got fixed. I think the NBA All-Star game moved. I've heard North Carolinians care about basketball, so I think that was kind of a dagger to the midsection. But companies said, we can't keep doing business in the state in the same way if you don't fix this. So they fixed it. And actually 6 months later, Texas considered essentially the same bathroom bill. This time, companies can learn. People can learn, companies can learn. Companies thought, it's a lot easier to just stop a bill from passing than to repeal it or kind of fix it afterwards, because that's a public fight where people get egg on their face, like I voted for this and now we're undoing it. So in Texas, when this bill was being debated, from the get-go they said, if you pass it, we're leaving, effectively. I mean, I'm oversimplifying the message a bit. It never passed. And the same thing happened in a bunch of other states. So companies moved from, we don't discriminate, to we are advocates against discrimination, and we have influence, and we're damn well going to use it. So I think we're at a moment in time on climate that is similar to where we were 8 years ago on LGBT rights, where A, we need companies to use their influence, and B, the zeitgeist is such that I think the stars are aligning to push companies to do it. And so they need to move from action to advocacy. For those of you who are familiar with the literature and the lingo and the anti-bullying world, they need to move from being bystanders, so they're good, they're not doing bad stuff, they're not polluting, to being upstanders. I mean, they are advocates against bad stuff broadly. They're pushing back against the bullies, they're stopping the bullying, the harassment, the whatever. They're helping get policies put in place that stop the pollution. That's what we need. So what would, and I know there's some people here from Citizens Climate Lobby and Business Climate Lobby and other groups that have been deep in the policy world for years. What would a policy, science-based policy agenda look like? Okay, and so I've enumerated here what I think are some critical principles. Number one, it needs to be aligned with the latest science. So that's going to change. If we continue dithering in 2 or 3 years, the policies we're going to need to get us where we need to be are going to be much more stringent than what they are today. What we need today is way more stringent than what it was 10 years ago. I mean, I feel bad for the people who have a very strong conservative free market philosophy and only want that kind of approach, because that might have worked, that alone might have worked 20 or 30 years ago, or maybe 10. It's not enough today. We need other policies too. I think it needs to be rooted in climate justice, because what is driving the shift in public sentiment and the energy and urgency on this issue is mostly young people. And they think of this as a human rights and justice, environmental justice issue. Many of them, not all, but many of them. And so if you want to build the political coalition and the power to actually get real policies passed, if it's not rooted in climate justice, I think that's going to be really hard. It needs to be politically possible, which means we need to check our ideologies at the door, whatever they are, because you may think this is the economists tell me this is the most efficient thing, so we need to do that, and I don't want to talk about anything else. Well, if that means we don't do anything, then the fact that that would be efficient doesn't matter if it never gets enacted. So we need to be able to work with a large coalition of different interest groups in any given jurisdiction, any region, and find something that is politically possible. And I think a price on carbon is an important one, but we've also seen a lot of evidence that it doesn't do as much as some of the advocates think it will, certainly not a politically feasible price on carbon. You know, if we're $500 or $1,000 a ton, I might feel reasonably confident it would get us where we need to go. If it's $20 or $40 a ton and increases slowly to 100, it'll make some difference, but it's not going to create the transformation we need. And we saw in the state of Washington, for example, they failed twice to pass a price on carbon. Once was a revenue neutral fee and dividend, once was a carbon tax. They also did it at the ballot box, and passing any kind of tax at the ballot box is probably just really hard. It needs to be transformational, not incremental. I mean, this is an emergency. We can't, incremental change, everyone doing their bit. We need the whole economy to do a lot. And the thing I've hit on several times, we need policies where we can look at it and say, with reasonable certainty, we will hit the 2030 target. And I think given the risk if we don't, my preference would be, you know what, let's do enough to kind of overshoot the 2030 target, to do better, because odds are some of this stuff won't work as well as we think it will. So let's aim higher, and hopefully we land there, or aim lower in terms of warming, whatever, higher in terms of decarbonization. Because otherwise, whatever we aim at will probably fall short. So I do think we need a price on carbon. And if that's the first thing we can get in some jurisdictions, great. But we also need complementary policies like clean energy mandates, renewable portfolio standards going up to, by date X, we'll have 100% clean energy on the grid. We need tax credits, we need EV mandates, we need building codes. You want to get natural gas out of buildings? It's building codes. Certainly for new buildings, and then we need policies that actually incentivize and help, socialize maybe the cost of getting out of existing buildings. Because is it fair to tell someone who 10 years ago bought a house with natural gas that, well, we all thought that was great 10 years ago, but now you're kind of out of luck. You got to rip the natural gas out in the next decade, and it's on you to pay for it because society has said this is not okay. I mean, that's a conversation we need to have. How do we deal with that? We need R&D for hard to decarbonize sectors like cement and air travel and ocean travel and other things that are large buckets of emissions and we don't have good solutions for today, and so on. So there's a suite of policies that we need. And it's going to be different in different jurisdictions. The business case for this, I think, is easy. I mean, this is, a lot of NGOs have been harping on this, and a lot of companies, including the ones I work for. It's like, this makes business sense. We have bought clean energy, we've bought cleaner vehicles, now electric vehicles, we've invested in energy efficiency, we're saving money. Business case absolutely makes sense, and it makes sense for the economy as a whole. I think there's lots of evidence for that. And the business case, the alternative of not acting, the negative consequences are so potentially dire that I think it makes the business case a no-brainer for acting. So why aren't we? Well, the business case that, if you buy clean energy today, you can do it and you can actually save money on your electricity bill is good for getting companies to take action in their own operations, and good for getting me to put solar in my house or to buy an EV because the total cost of ownership is lower, especially with tax credits and so on. But going from there to how do we decarbonize the whole system is harder. And I think part of the problem here, just to digress for a second, I fell into sustainability kind of by accident, or I came into it sideways. I was interested in climate, and I found a job that started out as climate and energy and became sustainability. What I've observed is that in the world of sustainability, we basically push sustainability people to speak the language of finance. The only way to justify something is by putting it in the language of finance. The only way to sell a project or anything is to say it makes economic sense, bottom line, earnings per share sense for the company. And that's the way most decisions are made, or well, in the end, that's the way they're justified. A lot of decisions are made because the CEO says, we're going to do this, and I believe it's the right strategy. And then there's a lot of post-hoc justification. But climate is not just a financial problem, it's a moral and human problem. And many sustainability efforts are rooted in morality and humanity. But then we have to sell them in terms of the bottom line. And sometimes, that doesn't quite pencil out. So I think we need to get business to learn to speak the language of morality and humanity, not just get sustainability people trying to save humanity from the climate emergency to speak the language of finance. You may have seen the recent letter from the Business Roundtable, which I think was actually basically saying the purpose of business is not just to maximize shareholder value, so shareholder primacy has been dethroned. It's a broad range of stakeholder value. So shareholders, employees, the communities we live and work in, sort of the broad environment and so on. It's a great statement. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And if business people have the language and the tools to think about how to weigh the apples and oranges of earnings per share and how many people in Bangladesh are going to drown. I wasn't trained to think that way. I don't think we have, I think moral philosophers have those tools. I think most of us really don't. But I think we need to, those are muscles we need to build. So let me go back to Greta, and not just her. I'm using her as a proxy for all of the young people, the 6 or 8 million in the streets a few weeks ago, and the 1,000 young people like her from all around the world in all different creeds and colors and you name it, who are really leading this youth movement. Because they're freaked out about climate change, and they're freaked out about their own future, but they also, they're showing an amazing amount of empathy for everybody around the world. They see it as a moral problem of human rights and the future of civilization. And they're saying that with real clarity. Companies need them. Companies need young people as customers, someday as shareholders, when they have enough money to actually buy stock. And in the near term, especially as employees. I mean, young people, maybe not 14-year-olds or 16-year-olds, but 22-year-olds and 25-year-olds, many of them have jobs working for companies. And the 16-year-olds will have jobs someday, and companies want to hire them. And if companies alienate young people by being complicit with sending us all off a cliff, they're going to have a problem. So this gets to my final points. In the world of policy and politics, companies prefer not to get involved in fights they don't have to get involved in. So, for Facebook, they've got to get engaged in privacy policy because it's central to their business. But they don't have to get involved in climate or clean energy policy. And they mostly don't. They have some, as have many other companies, but some. They think of silence as neutrality, and they portray it that way. It's not. Because in the climate world, we have an enormous amount of power and influence on the other side fighting climate action. Every fossil fuel company is pretty much all in on fighting climate action. The Initiative 1631 in Washington State last November, which was the carbon tax on the ballot, the fossil fuel industry put $34 million into ad campaigns to torpedo it, and they succeeded. The pro campaign that was trying to get it passed, I think, had about 15 million. And I have heard that the fossil fuel companies were prepared to basically, whatever the pro side spent, they were going to double it. For them, it's a fight to the death. And they're going to fight. So there's an enormous amount of power and influence pushing back against climate action. So in that situation, being a bystander is not neutrality, it's complicity. And I think young people are beginning to wake up to this. NGOs are raising the bar. Yesterday, I think about a dozen environmental NGOs released a letter urging companies to use their influence and be real advocates for real climate policy, science-based policy, and to stop using their influence against it, sometimes kind of implicitly, because if you're a member of the Chamber of Commerce, you are lending your business's voice to and supporting them in the climate denial and anti-climate action work they've been doing for decades. So it's complicity. Young people are recognizing this, NGOs are, and this is why I think it's so important to root these policies in climate justice, because that's how young people see it. And if you adopt a purely sort of technocratic approach to solving this problem, you may help us solve climate, but I don't think you're going to make young people very happy. And if young people don't like you, they're not going to buy your products. They're not going to want to work for you. They eventually won't, when they have money, won't want to buy your stock. So that's a real cost to your business. So just to close, if your company or companies need a business case for stepping up as advocates for making this pretty big leap, and it is a leap. Let me just use a somewhat overused quote from Wayne Gretzky when asked, well, how do you play hockey so well? He quoted his father who said, "Don't skate to where the puck has been, skate to where it's going." So leadership for the last decade has been decarbonize your operations. That's where the puck has been. Where the puck is going is be a champion for climate action globally, societally, systemically. And young people are expecting this, NGOs are expecting this, and companies that don't step up can expect to suffer as a result. So back to my call to action, companies need to support science-based policies everywhere they operate, everywhere they source materials, products, et cetera. Pressure, encourage, cajole, browbeat. I'm not encouraging violence, but whatever you have to do to get your peers to do the same, because it's an emergency. So time to step up, make the leap, speak up. That's what leadership looks like for the next decade, and it's what the world needs. Thank you. I'm stunned that was right on time.
So huge thanks to Bill. We're going to do a Q&A. We only have one working mic, so I'm going to help him identify perfect. And it looks like we have our first question right here.
Right. So to paraphrase, expand my comments on shareholder value versus stakeholder value, especially when you think about big funds, whether it's retirement funds or just investment funds in general. It's a really hard problem. So I think the Business Roundtable was talking about from the point of view of you're the management of a company, the board, the CEO, the other top management. What is your responsibility? And for the last 45 years, it's been shareholder value. Maximize shareholder value has been increasingly viewed as that's it. Anything other than that is do-gooder, crazy stuff. There are probably other words they use for it too. But the notion of companies should think about a broader range of stakeholders and the impact on them, I think is a welcome shift. And it was more of a fact of life in companies 50 or 60 years ago, I think, where companies thought and acted on the larger context, not just doing whatever they could for their own bottom line. But when you think about an investment fund, whether it's a retirement fund or one of BlackRock's massive funds or an index fund, if the responsibility that those fund managers feel is maximizing return, then it gets to the same question of, well, if maximizing that return is continuing to drive society off a cliff, maybe they need to be doing something differently. And that's where some of the divest, invest movement is pushing. So the comment was about looking for major leverage points. And I think the leverage point that I've been pointing out, which is mostly unused today, is companies using their influence in the jurisdictions where they operate, city, county, state, national, even international, though the international stuff to date on climate has mostly been non-binding, to drive policy change. But there are many other leverage points, and some of them are also not used much today. So the one you raised is around insurance. Many businesses can't really operate without insurance. And if you look at the insurance industry, I didn't understand this until maybe 15 years ago. It's not just there are insurance companies, there are reinsurance companies that insure the insurance companies that take on the really catastrophic risks. And they have enormous power, because if they say to all the insurance companies that they are a backstop for, we're not going to be a backstop unless you do X. If all the reinsurance companies say that, and there aren't, as Carl said, there are only maybe 10 of them, I don't know the exact number, but there aren't that many, that would create a lot of change potentially very quickly. And so there are some groups that are working to put pressure on and get the insurance and reinsurance companies to change. And I think we may see some real success in that over the next couple of years. I hope we do. So the comment was, and I'm partly repeating this because A, you don't have a mic, and partly for the recording, it's not going to get it. Asking companies to be upstanders instead of bystanders is a little bit abstract. Supporting a science-based policy agenda is kind of abstract. What does that mean in practice? And I think I'd love to see companies say, yes, we will support a science-based policy agenda. And we will be champions for that everywhere we have influence. That would be great. But in the end, what matters is, okay, you're in a jurisdiction and here's a policy that's being debated. Are they stepping up and supporting it or not? And that doesn't mean it's a blank check. Any climate-related policy companies should just automatically support. There are going to be ones that are badly written. There are going to be ones they disagree with for some reason. There are going to be ones that they just fight because it hurts their business. But right now, they're almost always on the sidelines. So I'll give you some examples. And I think it really then comes down to specific examples. A little over a year ago in California, we passed SB 100, which mandates 100% clean energy on the grid by, I think, 2045. It also accelerated the renewable portfolio standard from where it had been. It almost didn't pass. We're talking California, right? one of the bluest states in the country. And this policy, which was only about electricity, but was pretty well aligned with the science. I would argue actually it doesn't really go fast enough, but will probably move faster than it requires. But it almost failed. I mean, I was in a meeting the day before the final vote where one of the people there got word that they were 5 votes short of passing it. And there was a massive, sort of effort to get people to call in to their assembly members and state senators. There was a pretty strong effort to push companies that hadn't yet spoken up to speak up. In the end, I think about 35 companies supported it publicly. There were probably a few more that made phone calls to, state reps, but didn't make a public statement. And it passed. And legislation is binary, so it passed, and that's a win, but it almost failed, and that's in California. We're not yet on the track, in California, we're not on the track we need to be in transportation. We're not on the path we need to be on in buildings. We're not on the path we need to be on in industry, and we're not actually on quite a fast enough path, I would argue, in electricity. So we're not done in California, but California companies operate in other places, other states, other countries. The example I gave of what happened with the LGBT rights fights in other states, the pressure in Indiana and North Carolina, it came from companies that were operating there. They weren't all headquartered there, in fact, most of them weren't. And the pressure that, the employee pressure that got them to move, in many cases was certainly not just from employees in Indiana and North Carolina. It was from employees in California and Seattle and New York and Boston and Atlanta and other places. So I don't think California companies are done. I think, in fact, I hope they're just getting started, both in California but also outside. So I don't think this is easy, but you could say the same thing about gay rights or civil rights in general. It's not that there's one bill you pass and now everyone's free and equal and it's all great. It's an ongoing evolution where there's a high-level principle of we stand for civil rights, we stand for equality, we stand for climate justice. And then there's okay, well, this policy, do we support it or not? That's going to take effort to sort out. Not simple. So the question, to summarize, so ERISA, ERISA, Employee Retirement Something Act in the Income Security Act in the 70s had the perhaps probably unintended side effect of pushing a much shorter term outlook on companies in terms of Wall Street and so on. And the actions taken by the insurance commissioner, I think in California, right, actually pushed insurance companies to really consider climate and the impact of climate change in their portfolios and their portfolios on climate change, right? So one of those policies had, in the end, I think arguably a negative impact on the economic system, and ultimately that is playing out in terms of a negative impact on climate and many other things. The other policy was very intentionally aiming for a positive impact on climate. And the question was, how do we avoid the bad, usually unintended consequences and ensure they're good? I don't have a simple answer to that. Unintended consequences are real, and I think avoiding them requires a lot of argument and analysis and thought, and you're not going to avoid them all. That's partly, I am personally more of a fan of, if we're going to legislate things, let's legislate the outcome, because the political process is hard and messy and slow, and we don't get a lot of bites at that apple. So let's legislate the outcome, like SB 100. By 2045, no carbon emissions from our electricity grid. Or like New York, which just passed a law which basically says the entire state, the economy in the entire state will be net zero carbon by, it was either 2045 or 2050. They're pushing some of what would otherwise be controversial political decisions onto regulatory agencies, where they can be more responsive and respond more quickly, and it's less political. But also, the point I was trying to make, and I would argue that a carbon market is not about the outcome so much as about the mechanism for achieving the outcome. Just as a carbon tax is a mechanism, it's sending a market signal which might achieve the desired outcome, might not. But if it doesn't, then you have to go back to the legislative well and have those political fights. If you legislate the outcome, we want to be carbon, net zero carbon, whatever, by date X, and here are the broad outlines of how we think that should happen. Regulatory agencies, this is what New York just did, regulatory agencies go figure out how that's going to happen and then adjust every couple years as we learn. I think that we are much more likely to get closer to the path we need to be on and then to stay on it. That's my own personal feeling. The question was, I talked a lot about kind of broad policy and what companies need to do, but as a young employee, the questioner is a month into a job, which is great. She feels powerless. And how can she make her voice heard? How can she influence her company? And that's not easy. I don't know if you saw what happened at Amazon over the last year. Amazon employees organized. They pushed internally. They worked a lot talking to the sustainability team and others. They weren't happy with the answers they were getting. And finally they said, okay, well, we're going to act. And then they realized that we have stock, because tech companies give employees stock. Lots of companies do. And so they had standing to file a shareholder resolution. So they did. And that pushed the company, I think that pushed the company to accelerate some of the things they'd been thinking about, and they made some announcements in the spring. They asked the employees to withdraw the shareholder resolution. The employees said no, and then they wrote a letter to the board, which was much more expansive in the ask of the company. And it was an open letter published on the internet, and they asked for signatures of Amazon employees. The last count, I think they had over 8,600 signatures. It was about 12% of their corporate workforce. So I think the short answer, and then I think about 1,500 of them walked out on September 20th in support of the youth strike. I think the short answer is, it's hard, it's about organizing, and it's about collective power and a collective voice, not just one voice. So you need to find fellow employees who share your concern and your passion and then work together to organize. I think the Amazon employees have published a kind of handbook or playbook for organizing around this stuff, which I think is a good starting point. I would love to talk to you about how you could begin to push your company and work with other employees and at NVIDIA, but also people at other companies to... Right. There's the Silicon Valley Green Team Network, which is, I think, a good place to start doing some of that organizing here. But it's about organizing. And 40, 50 years ago, we would have called it labor organizing. And unions were much bigger and more powerful, and many more people were in unions back then. I don't know that this is about union organizing and having a sort of certified union. That actually comes with a lot of constraints. But it's about labor organizing and using your collective voice and power as employees. There is risk. Companies can fire you if you're a troublemaker. So you need to be careful and you need to be thoughtful. But it's not a simple answer, but I'd say that's good. One more question? Yeah, over there. Question was, when am I going to give the talk at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group? I'd love to. And this is the first time I've really talked about this publicly. And thank you, Lauren and Acterra, for inviting me. Thank you. Thanks.